Night. Wind howled. Dust swirled. Ellie Mae Harper jolted awake to a strange rustling outside the dried-up creek bed. She gripped the rusty horseshoe above her bed and held her breath. Someone or something was moving out there, dragging a foot across the earth. At her door stood not death, but a mystery. A limping native girl, bruised and bloodied, face smeared with dirt, eyes wide with silent pleading. Ellie didn't ask who she was. She just pulled her inside. By sunrise, more than 50 armed tribespeople stood in a wide circle around her crumbling barn. And Ellie knew. Her life had just crossed an invisible line. Ellie was only 9 the first time she heard a coyote cry like a woman dying. That same week, her parents were buried side by side under a crooked pine tree, fever having taken them both in 2 days flat. She remembered the coughing, the smell of boiled rags and spoiled milk, her father sweating through his shirt and still trying to hold a book steady for her at night, her mother crying only once. Not from pain, but from the sound of Ellie's small hand knocking on the door they could no longer answer. After the undertaker rode off, Ellie waited a whole day before locking the cabin door and never returning. She packed a small satchel with dried beans, a tin cup, and her mother's journal, full of poems and pressed flowers and recipes for medicines that could ease grief or fevers. She left the rest: her father's pipe, the dented washtub, the wooden toys he'd carved for a child they thought would live a soft life. She made her way north, barefoot and wild-eyed, stealing bread from a wagon once, then crying for hours after. That first winter she nearly starved. But she didn't. By 11, she'd found a broken barn nestled against a gully near Montana Ridge. No roof on one side, but enough shelter to survive. She patched the holes with wool sacks, bartered for a pot from a passing tinker, and built a small fire circle where she'd roast roots and the occasional field mouse. Her only company was a rooster named Jacob, who wandered in one spring and never left. He slept near her feet and crowed every morning like they still had a farm to wake. The people in town, a day's walk away, called her cursed, said she spoke to shadows and wandered too close to where wolves were known to hunt. Children dared each other to throw stones at her barn. She chased them off with a slingshot and a voice that didn't tremble. She wrote in her mother's journal every night. New pages. Her pages. Sometimes just one line: "I am still here." Other nights she told stories of ghosts who whispered secrets into kindling flames, of a girl with dirt on her face and power in her spine. She wasn't trying to be brave. She just didn't want to disappear. She taught herself to make teas from pine needles and poultices from dandelion roots. She kept a ribbon tied around the old horseshoe above her bed, her grandmother's charm against hunger and harm. And every night, just before sleep, she whispered the same thing: "Not today." Then came the rustling in the creek bed. The wind shifted the next night. Not in a way Ellie could explain. Not colder or sharper, but older, like something long buried had stirred. The sky was too clear, the stars too bright. Jacob, the rooster, refused to perch on his usual rafter. Instead, he hid beneath the straw pile and didn't make a sound. Ellie had just finished her evening tea when the sound came again. Faint, but sharp. A whimper, maybe, or pain riding the wind. She stepped outside barefoot, the dirt cold against her heels. No moon, just darkness and stars and that smell, blood, old and sour, carried from the dry creek bed. She crouched low, moved without breath, the way the coyote taught her. She'd once watched a mother fox lead a hunter away from her kits with a limp and a cry. Ellie had learned to mimic that same walk when she needed to disappear. But what she saw below the ridge wasn't an animal. It was a girl, young, limping, barefoot like Ellie, but bleeding from one ankle. Her dress was torn and soaked dark in places. She moved like a ghost, eyes wide, jaw clenched, and one arm tucked tight to her chest. Ellie stepped into her path. The girl flinched hard, nearly crumpled to the dirt. Then their eyes met. No words, just silence. And in it, something that cracked Ellie wide open. The same look she saw in her own face that first winter. Not fear, emptiness. Ellie helped her up slowly, gripping her under the arms. The girl didn't speak, didn't cry. She just let herself be guided like someone too tired to pretend anymore. They reached the barn, and Ellie pulled her inside, past Jacob's silent form, past the hanging jars of herbs and the bundle of fox pelts. She laid the girl on her cot and touched her face gently. Half her cheek was bruised, her lower lip split, her collarbone stuck out sharp, like she hadn't eaten in days. The girl was native. Ellie saw it in her features, her earrings. One missing, one bent, and the faint tattoo on her wrist, mostly hidden by blood and dirt. Ellie's hands froze. She'd heard what the settlers said. You help one of them, and your barn will burn before morning. But this girl wasn't a raider. She wasn't part of a war party or carrying a weapon. She was small, broken, alone. Ellie grabbed a blanket from the far hook and wrapped it around her. The girl flinched again, but didn't resist. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves scattered against the boards. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, long and low, like a funeral song for someone the world forgot. Ellie looked down at her, this stranger lying half-conscious on her bed. Then she did the only thing she knew. She lit the fire, boiled water, and reached for her grandmother's herbs. Ellie stood still, the kettle hissing behind her. The girl, no older than 15, lay curled under the blanket, barely breathing. Her fingers twitched like she was still running, even in sleep. Blood had dried along her ribs. A piece of arrow's haft was still lodged near her hip. Ellie swallowed hard. She'd been alone so long she forgot what it meant to choose for someone else. She crossed the barn, found the medicine kit her grandmother stitched from old flour sacks. Inside, wild willow bark, dried yarrow, a sliver of soap, 2 wrapped needles, and the last of her fire salve, made from bear fat and mountain sage. She boiled water in her iron pot and tore an old cotton dress into strips. When the water hissed and bubbled, she dipped the cloth and started wiping the girl's wounds, careful not to speak. Words would break the spell, make it real. But the girl moaned just once, and Ellie heard it for what it was. Not pain, but fear. Not the fear of dying. The fear of being seen. Her hands stopped. She stared down at the girl, who now watched her through slitted eyes, like a fox caught in a trap. Ellie had seen that look before, on herself, so she did something strange. Quietly, she turned her back and began speaking. Not to the girl, but to the fire. My name's Ellie Mae Harper, she said softly. I live in this barn with a rooster named Jacob and a lot of stories that aren't true. She kept her hands busy, crushing willow bark, mixing it into paste. They say I'm cursed. That if you see me in town, you best cross the road. That if I walk past your crops, they'll fail. She paused. They're not wrong. Things around me don't stay right. Behind her, the girl breathed easier. Ellie turned back, pressed a salve-soaked cloth to the wound. I ain't gonna ask who you are, or where you come from. I figure if you wanted to say, you would've by now. She wrapped the girl's arm, then the gash near her hip. The blood had slowed. Fever was coming, but not yet. When she finished, she placed a cup of pine tea near her head and sat on the floor beside the cot. Her hands were shaking. One step forward, and every settler for 10 miles would call her traitor. Might even ride out with torches and rope. One step back, and this girl would die alone maybe by morning. Ellie didn't move for a long time. Then she leaned forward, dipped a finger into the leftover salve, and smeared a small line across her own forehead. An old sign for protection she'd learned from her grandmother. Her voice was quiet, but steady. You're not alone, she said, eyes on the flames. Not while I breathe. Fever came with the dawn. The girl thrashed beneath the blanket, face flushed, lips muttering in a language Ellie didn't understand. Her body burned like coal, too hot, too fast. Ellie crushed snowberry root and thyme, wrapped hot stones in damp cloth, and whispered stories into the dark. Stories about her mother's garden, about a rooster who thought he was a lion, about rivers that sang to the moon. The girl didn't respond. Only when Ellie laid a hand on her forehead and whispered, "You're safe now," did the tension ease, if only a little. She found herself saying that again and again. You're safe now. as if saying it enough could make it true. But by morning the air changed again. Not the wind, the earth. The ground shivered beneath the barn like something massive stirred far away. A pulse, a warning, then hoofbeats. Slow at first, then louder. Dozens of them. Rhythmic, steady. Too many for a hunting party. Too organized for settlers. Ellie ran to the door and looked out over the ridge. Painted riders emerged from the mist, moving like shadows cut loose from the trees. Feathers in their hair. Wore paint across their faces and arms. Spears and torches in hand. They didn't shout. Didn't raise weapons. They just came. A slow, silent tide forming a wide circle around the barn. Ellie stepped back, heart pounding, the memory of her mother's journal pressing into her mind. When they ride in silence, it means judgment has already been made. The circle tightened. Jacob clucked once, low and anxious, then vanished into the hay. Ellie felt the girl stir behind her. A hand touched her shoulder, weak, but urgent. The girl tried to sit up, eyes wide. She muttered something between breaths. Then again. One word Ellie could almost catch. Naniska. The name landed heavy. The war leader of the Broken Sky clan. A name settlers used like thunder, rarely spoken, always feared. Ellie turned back to the ridge. At the center of the formation, one rider dismounted. She wore a wolfskin cloak. Tall, proud, silent. Her face painted in long lines of ash and red. Eyes sharp as obsidian. Naniska. She walked slowly toward the barn, stopping just beyond the threshold. Ellie stood between her and the girl. Bare feet on the cold wood, arms shaking but still raised. She didn't know if it mattered, but she stood there anyway, and Naniska stared at her, long and silent, as if weighing something invisible in the air. Behind her, a warrior unrolled a hide and placed it on the ground. Another set down a small bundle of roots and herbs. A third laid a string of carved bone medallions along the dirt, like a borderline. Ellie didn't move, didn't speak. Then, without a word, Naniska raised her arm, and the entire warband stopped. No sound. Only the sound of wind curling through the brittle grass. Then Naniska stepped forward, and everything in Ellie's life changed. Naniska stepped into the barn like it was sacred ground. Her boots made no sound. Her eyes, cold and clear, moved past Ellie and settled on the girl, who now sat up, trembling, clutching the blanket to her chest. Ellie stepped aside, slowly, but stayed close. The girl, still fevered, raised her hand, pointing to the strips of bandage, the salve, the water bowl, the small bundle of roots Ellie had left on the cot's edge. Then to the fire, and to the stone circle that still glowed warm. She whispered something in her tongue, a single word. Then another, "Fire, sister." Naniska didn't blink. She looked around the barn, at the broken rafters, the dust-choked light through the roof slats, the old tobacco tin Ellie used for herbs. No emotion, no change in breath, nothing. The girl said more, faster now, voice rising with effort. She pointed to her chest, then to Ellie's hand, still faintly stained from mixing salve. She tapped her own ribs, where Ellie had dressed the wound. Then she held up a necklace, a small string of leather with a carved animal bone. She placed it in Ellie's palm and closed her fingers around it. Silence. Then Naniska turned away. Ellie opened her mouth, to ask, to plead. She wasn't sure, but no sound came. She didn't know the words for what she felt, only that it was cold, sudden, and deep. The warriors began to murmur in their own language. Low, sharp sounds, and Ellie caught something in their tone that twisted her gut. Disapproval. Not anger. Worse, disappointment. She stepped back, breath shallow. For the first time since she was 9, Ellie felt not fear, but shame. What if she had broken a law older than this land? What if tending the girl's wounds had ruined something sacred? Naniska faced her again. Her voice was slow, precise. You took her in. Ellie nodded, throat tight. You gave her fire, food, water. Again, a nod. No permission, no words, just hands, just choice. Ellie's fingers clenched. The necklace pressed into her palm, sharp and warm. I didn't think, she began. That is the truth, Naniska interrupted. You did not think. The words hit harder than any bullet. Ellie looked down. The girl had gone quiet again, head low, body shaking with silent tears. Ellie knelt beside her, unsure what she was doing, shielding her or seeking shelter herself. The fire cracked behind them. Naniska stepped forward once more and crouched beside the two girls. Her eyes were softer now, but her voice still cut. You broke a line, white child. A line drawn in blood. Ellie looked up, tears stinging her eyes. I didn't mean harm. Naniska studied her. Sometimes harm is born of kindness. Then she reached out, slow, deliberate, and placed her hand over Ellie's, where the bone necklace still lay. She is no longer just one of us, Naniska said. You made her something else. Between two fires. Ellie looked to the girl. She didn't understand the language, but she understood the meaning. And for the first time in her life, Ellie didn't know which way was home. The sky cracked with thunder, dry and loud, though no storm brewed above. A hawk wheeled overhead and vanished behind the ridgeline. The air stilled. Naniska stood and turned toward the circle of warriors. She walked with the weight of generations. Slow, steady, heavy with purpose. The warband parted as she passed. Then she stopped at the edge of the burial mound just beyond the barn. A quiet rise of earth ringed with stones and ash. Ellie had never dared to disturb it, though Jacob often paced there like he knew something lay beneath. Naniska knelt and placed both hands on the dirt. Then she whispered something so low it didn't sound like speech, more like wind caught in a prayer. She rose and faced the barn again. If the earth accepts the child, she said, we let her live. The warriors shifted, uncertain. Ellie blinked. What does that mean? Naniska raised a hand. Behind her, a young man stepped forward and unwrapped a deer-hide bundle. Inside, hot embers still glowing. Another laid kindling in a circle atop the mound, then stepped back. Naniska took a coal between her fingers and placed it in the center of the kindling. Nothing happened. Then, a breath of wind, and the fire caught. Flames leapt up like they'd been waiting. The branches crackled. Smoke spiraled straight upward. A tree behind the barn split with a deafening crack, its top half crashing to the ground in a hail of splinters. The warriors went utterly still. Naniska didn't flinch. She turned to Ellie, her eyes dark and unreadable. She is not our enemy, she said. She is a witness. Ellie's chest tightened. Witness to what? A kindness? A crime? A crossing? Then Naniska's voice softened, not with weakness, but with something heavier, decision. But will you come with us? She asked. Leave this place behind? Forever. Ellie froze. Jacob clucked once inside the barn. She looked at the girl. Still weak, eyes glazed with pain, but alive. Breathing. Watching. Ellie thought of her mother's journal, tucked under the cot. Of the drawing she'd made last winter. A map of the ridge trails, marked with circles she never understood. Of the horseshoe above her bed, rusted and ribbon-wrapped. And she thought of what lay beyond that ridge, the land where these riders came from, the place no settler dared to map. Naniska waited. Behind her, warriors stood silent, watching. No threats, no weapons raised. Only one question. Would Ellie Mae Harper step over the line she'd drawn herself? With every root she boiled, every story she wrote, every quiet night she whispered, not today? She closed her eyes and whispered, yes. Ellie didn't even have time to pack. As soon as her answer left her lips, Naniska gave a single nod, not of thanks, but of acknowledgement, and the warband moved. Silent, swift, like a stream of wolves through the underbrush. Ellie helped the girl onto a small, spotted mare brought forward by one of the younger warriors. The girl winced but held on, her fingers knotting in the horse's mane. Ellie swung up behind her, heart pounding. Then hoofbeats, from behind the ridge. Fast, sharp, not the quiet rhythm of painted warriors. This was harder, heavier, metal. Jacob squawked from the barn, flapping his wings violently. Naniska turned just as they crested the hill, 6 men, uniforms glinting under the midday sun, rifles strapped across saddles. One held a spyglass. The leader rode tall in the saddle, red-faced and sweating beneath a deputy's hat. Sheriff Ridgerock's men. They came fast and without warning, dust rising like a funeral shroud behind them. Ellie's heart sank. They'd tracked the girl, followed the blood, the prints, the stories whispered in town. She could hear the voice of old Mrs. Keller now, 2 miles downriver. White girl gone quiet since that coyote night. Something wrong out there. If they found the girl, native and injured, in Ellie's care, they wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't give her a trial. The war paint on the surrounding warriors would be proof enough. Guns would come next. Naniska didn't hesitate. "We go now," she said, eyes on the ridge. "Or you stay and face their justice." Ellie looked back at the barn. Her home. Inside. The journal with her mother's poems. A hand-carved wooden doll with one glass eye. Her grandmother's wedding ring sewn into the hem of her only good dress. Memories. Ghosts. Not enough to anchor her anymore. Around her neck, she felt the bone medallion the girl had given. Still warm, as if it held fire of its own. She didn't speak. She kicked her heels once, and the mare took off after the others, hoofs pounding the dry earth, the wind clawing at her braid. Behind them, shouts rang out. Then the crack of a rifle. A shot whistled past her ear and struck a tree with a sound like an axe bite. The warriors scattered into formation. Tight, controlled, trained. Ellie clung to the girl in front of her and whispered into her hair. "Hold on. Just hold on." The forest swallowed them whole. They didn't stop riding until the sun dipped low and the air turned cold. The warriors led them through paths no settler had ever seen. Deer trails hidden beneath fern and stone. Along ridges where pine trees whispered secrets older than fences. They crossed a river with no bridge, fording the icy water as one body, tight and fast. The girl, Tala, they called her now, clung to Ellie like a child does a story she cannot let go. Ellie rode numb, not from cold, but from everything behind her. The barn, the creek bed, the horseshoe above her cot, Jacob's cry fading into the dust. When they crested the final ridge, the land changed. Below them stretched a hidden valley, cradled by trees and mist. Smoke curled gently from small fires. Children's laughter echoed off canyon walls. Horses ran free in the low meadow, moving like water made flesh. A village. Alive. Not the savage place the settlers warned of. Not the painted nightmare from schoolhouse tales. This was different. Women stirred pots over flames. Elders sat carving bone or weaving hides. Dogs barked. Wind chimes made of antler clicked softly in the breeze. No one screamed. No one drew weapons. They had been waiting. Naniska rode ahead, then stopped and turned. Ellie followed, unsure. But Tala placed a hand over Ellie's where it gripped the reins. Steadying, thanking, asking. They dismounted. Children approached first, curious and unafraid. A small boy touched Ellie's braid, then laughed and ran to fetch others. The girl stood with Ellie's hand in hers, eyes clearer now, fever broken. From a large fire pit near the center, elders emerged. Men and women marked with age and stories, faces lined with smoke and time. They didn't speak, just watched. Ellie stood still, unsure whether to kneel, bow or vanish. Then Tala limped forward, alone. She didn't cry, didn't plead. She pointed to her own bandaged leg. Then to Ellie's hands, stained with salve, marked with work. Then to the necklace around Ellie's neck. The circle murmured, a language Ellie didn't know, but the tone was clear. Not judgment, consideration. Then, a small child, no more than 4, broke through the circle. He walked straight to Ellie and tugged her skirt. She looked down. He stared up. Dark eyes. White. Sad. He said something. Just one line. Naniska translated softly from behind. He says, "She has the same sad eyes as me. Sad children shouldn't be alone." The circle fell still. Then one elder, a woman with hair like snow and a necklace made of crow feathers, stepped forward. She placed her hand over Ellie's chest, where the medallion hung. Her voice was low, kind. The spirits sent you to save her, because they knew we needed to save you too. The tribe didn't take Ellie as guest or prisoner. They took her as sister of the wounded flame. Years later, they would still tell the story. Not in English, not in books, but in songs sung around firelight, in beads strung in certain patterns, in a child's question answered with a knowing smile. They called her sister of the wounded flame, the girl who crossed a line no settler dared, not for glory, but for grace. Ellie never returned to the ridge. She never saw Jacob again, or the bent horseshoe above her cot. The journal stayed hidden beneath the ashes of a life left behind. But in the valley, she found something she never expected. Not forgiveness, but belonging. She learned their stories, learned their silences. She learned how to say thank you without words, how to grieve without asking why. Sometimes, late at night, she would hold Tala's hand. Grown stronger now, her limp faded, and whisper, "I'm still here." And Tala would whisper back, "Not alone." The land kept their secret, and the fire kept their truth. One day, a lonely orphan helped a limping native girl. By dawn, an entire tribe stood at her door, not for vengeance, but for truth.